Last week we looked at the eternal occupation of heaven, gazing on God. And this week we're thinking about the extraordinary truth that God gazes on us, that God is eternally mindful of you and of me. And that means that you are on God's mind right now. Now, maybe you hear that and you think, well, I'm not quite sure I want God gazing on me. And it sounds a bit like that teacher who always seemed to know when I was misbehaving. Do I want God's gaze? God's gaze is the gaze of love. It's not a gaze that's trying to catch you out. It's the gaze that looks because you love somebody so much. If you have given your life to Jesus, that means that you have been placed in Christ, in the embrace of Christ and into his righteousness. Ephesians chapter 1 says that we are in the beloved. It's the most beautiful phrase. And the good news is that God made him who had no sin to become sin for us, so that we might become the righteousness of Christ. That's 2 Corinthians chapter 5, verse 21. And that means we don't need to fear God's gaze because we've been placed in the righteousness of Christ. And every day we can take a simple step of faith and clothe ourselves in the righteousness of Christ. Clothe ourselves in Christ and know that's how God sees us. I wonder whether this week, every day when you get up and get dressed, you could see yourself clothed in the righteousness of Christ, because that's how God sees you, holy and blameless. It changes how we live when we live before the loving eyes of God. I have spent way too much time in my life chasing after other people's approval. But what if we dare trust that the most important eyes of all are watching us with love? How would that change how you live this week? The Puritans had this beautiful phrase that they said they would live before an audience of one. I wonder who is your audience, your literal audience, or maybe the audience in your head? Who's that inner jury? When we discover that God sees us with hope-filled love, we can not only be set free, but we can begin to do that for one another. We can ask God to show us how he sees those around us so that we don't give up on anyone. There is such a deep security when we know that we have been seen by God from before the creation of the world. There's a really beautiful encounter in John's Gospel right at the beginning that illustrates this. And Jesus sees Nathanael coming towards him. And we're told that Jesus said of him, "Here is truly an Israelite, in whom there is no deceit." And Nathanael asks Jesus, "Well, where did you get to know me?" And Jesus replies, "I saw you under the fig tree before Philip called you." You see, Jesus saw Nathanael first. Jesus saw you first before you saw him. My friend Anne really knows this. She was playing tennis with her husband in Belgium long before she came to a personal faith, a living faith of her own in Jesus. and she suddenly collapsed of a heart attack on this tennis court. And it was a few decades ago, and hardly anybody had mobile phones then. But amazingly, a woman who was parked nearby happened to turn at the moment that Anne fell, and she saw her, and she happened to have a mobile phone in her car. And she called an ambulance, and the ambulance nearby happened to have a cardiologist on board. Anne knows that God was watching over her, even at that time when she did not see him. Jesus sees us before we see him. He saw you, he knew you, and he chose you before you had even begun to glimpse who he was. And you know, he doesn't stop watching over us. Right now, he sees you. It's even one of his names. I love discovering that one of the names of God is the God who sees me. And those of you who have read this chapter in the book will have seen and read the story of Hagar, who was a rejected, mistreated, unimportant Egyptian slave girl who was given this great revelation of God, this revelation of his name, the God who sees me. She discovered that there is no one too unimportant to be seen by God. God sees you, and he constantly watches over you. He never forgets you. I sometimes use one of those little post-it notes to remind myself of something, but I find that the problem is that I will lose the post-it note. So if I really want to remember something, I'll write it on my hand. Do you know what? God tells us that we are engraved on the palm of his hands. We are forever before him. Just lift up your hand. It's right there. And that's how much you are present in God's mind. In Psalm 8, it says that he is mindful of you. Isn't that amazing? For me, at my moments of grief and sorrow in the last years, it has meant so much to know that God sees and cares. And I love the story of the reaction of Jesus at a funeral in which a widow had lost her only son. You can't imagine how desperately she was grieving. And we're told Jesus saw her and his heart went out to her. And that's what happens when God sees us. His heart goes out to us. And that means that when it comes to our relationship with God, we don't need to put on the masks. We might be wearing masks because of COVID, but we don't have to wear masks with God, because he sees it all and he can handle our rawest and fiercest emotions. We have a God who sees us. He sees the trouble and the injustice in our world. Psalm 10 says, "You, God, see the trouble of the afflicted. You consider their grief and you take it in hand." And that's what he was doing on the cross. He was taking the trouble and affliction of our world in hand, and he hasn't stopped. And because we are called to follow him, we are called to see the trouble and affliction in our world, to take it in hand. We know the God who sees us. God sees you today. He knows the troubles in your life. He knows the frustrations, the guilt, the shame. He knows it all, and nothing is too difficult for him. We have a God who sees the big picture that we cannot see, and who sees the little practical details. And I know that there'll be many of you who have wonderful examples that show you how God sees you. He's shown you how much he wants to be involved in those little details of your life. And I could tell you so many stories about the ways that God has so surprised me that he cares about the little practical bits of my life. We know the God who sees us. So right now, take a moment and thank God that he is the God who sees you. He always has, and he always will, because he never wants to take his eyes off you.